I'd like to welcome all participants to this webinar. The topic we will look at today with 4 speakers is women's participation and voice in decision-making about mining. And today we'll focus on cases from Colombia. The webinar is hosted by the Environmental Governance Program for Sustainable Natural Resource Management. This is a joint initiative of the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency and the United Nations Development Program. We'll hear more about this a bit later in our session. The session is also supported by Learning for Nature, an e-learning program by the United Nations Development Program. Learning for Nature connects biodiversity policymakers, change makers, and on-the-ground subject matter experts, and aims to build capacity to scale up efforts for nature. And we thank the team at Learning for Nature for their great collaboration with us and use of this wonderful technology to bring us together from all over the world. My name is Sarah Deitch, and I will be facilitating the session today, along with my colleague Felipe in Bogota. Before I continue, I would like to also mention that there will be a Spanish language session of this webinar taking place this afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. If you would like to register for the Spanish language session, there is a link in the chat box of the control panel of this webinar. Feel free to do so. If you would like to attend both webinars, you're more than welcome. So my background is that I'm a mediator and facilitator. I focus on public dispute resolution, and also I work on multi-stakeholder dialogue with a focus on natural resource issues. I'm a consultant to UNDP for the Environmental Governance Program. My colleague, Felipe Lesmes Palacio, will also support the moderation of this session. Felipe is an economist and he holds a master's degree in social policy and development. He specializes in advocacy for environmental policy at the UNDP office in Bogota, Colombia, where he works on issues related to governance of the extractive sector and the relationship between human rights, the environment, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Felipe also works closely with the Environmental Governance Program. Before we begin and move into our exciting presenters that we have gathered today, I would like to remind all of you who are with us online about some of the dynamics of the webinar to make it run as smoothly as possible. Microphones will be muted during the presentations. This reduces the possibility of interference. The webinar will last 2 hours until approximately 1 p.m. Eastern. After the presentations are completed, we will open the question and answer session, and we look forward very much to hearing from you during that portion of the webinar. Please share your questions you have at any point during the presentations in the chat window, which is in the control panel, if you click on it. And in addition, you may raise your hand in the control panel of GoToWebinar. If you'd like to speak, to ask your question during the Q&A period, and the connection allows for it, if you do raise your hand, we will open your microphone at that time. The session is being recorded and it will be available on the Learning for Nature website, which is learningfornature.org. They also have a YouTube channel, and all participants at this webinar will receive an email with the recording when it's available. The webinar today aims to share with you practical approaches to addressing gender gaps in mining. We will consider how strengthening the participation and voice of women and girls in decision-making and governance of mining can improve development outcomes towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. We will draw insights from 2 cases from Colombia of initiatives that are effective in addressing key issues linked to mining. We will also highlight the approach of the Colombian Ministry of Energy and Mines and learn from some good practices in Colombian public policy from a gender perspective. The goal of this webinar is to also introduce topics from a new training on gender governance in mining that is in development and seek feedback from you about this. We have 4 main objectives today, and we hope that you will come away from this session with a better understanding of what the key gender gaps are related to mining, how governments can better address these issues as part of their regulatory and public policy response, taking into consideration a gender perspective. Third, how social, economic, and environmental outcomes from mining could be shaped by involving women and girls in decision making. And finally, what has been learned already from Colombia's experience, particularly in the artisanal and small-scale gold and coal sectors, on improving gender equity in mining. We'd also really appreciate your response on a survey that you'll receive following this webinar on how we can best deliver a training that is in development on strengthening policy responses to these gender gaps and issues in mining. And Sohini will be speaking more about that a little bit later. So again, today we focus on 3 key questions in this webinar. What are the reasons that women and girls are affected differently than men and boys from the mining sector? What policy tools can governments use to better address these gaps? And how has Colombia improved its public policy related to mining from a gender perspective? And what actions are they planning on taking moving forward? So we have 4 speakers that we're very much looking forward to lined up for today. And here's an overview of how the session will look and what you can expect for the rest of our time together. So we'll start with Sohini Mazumdar, and she will present to us UNDP and the Intergovernmental Forum for Mining Training and Development on women's participation and voice in decision-making about mining. My colleague Felipe will present on behalf of Ms. Luisa Fernanda Baca, and that is regarding public policy for the mining and energy sector in Colombia. Then we have Angela Maria Mesa from the Alliance for Responsible Mining, and she will present a case study of their work on behalf of herself and her colleague Ander Arcos, who also works on this project. And then our 4th speaker will be Javier Blanco, and he will present to us a case study from Colombia in the Chaco region that is being carried out by UN Women. Following our 4 speakers, we will have a moderated discussion for hopefully about half an hour, and we'll summarize some of the key things we heard and conclude and tell you where you can find the recording and materials. So without further hesitation, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sohini Mazumdar. Sohini is an environmental and social governance leader. She works for both the UN and the private sector, dealing with climate change adaptation and mitigation, energy and extractives, indigenous peoples engagement, and assessing and managing the environmental and social impacts of development. Sohini has worked across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. And currently, one project she's working on is for UNDP's Environmental Governance Program and the Intergovernmental Forum for Mining. And this is developing gender training materials that she will share some information about right now. So today she'll discuss with us some key aspects of these new training materials. And the floor is over to you, Sohini.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Sarah. I'll assume that you can hear me okay. Everyone, just write in the chat window if there's any problems with the sound. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity today to present on the really interesting work that's being carried out by UNDP's EGP program in partnership with IGF, and to have the chance to highlight the very innovative and practical work of our colleagues. Introducing EGP and IGF for those of you who are not yet familiar. The EGP is the Environmental Governance Program, and it's a joint initiative of the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency and the United Nations Development Program. And it supports countries to integrate environment and human rights into the governance of the mining sector. So the program provides targeted support in its first phase to 4 countries, one of them of which is Colombia, of course, Kenya, Mongolia, and Mozambique. So the program will be entering its 2nd phase this year. The EGP also works at the global and regional levels to support the exchange of innovative policy approaches within and across countries and regions. The IGF is the Intergovernmental Forum for Mining, and it counts 80 national governments as its members, including many from emerging countries. They host an annual forum with over 400 delegates in Geneva, as well as technical in-country meetings. They have partnerships with a range of organizations and focus on knowledge sharing. They've developed a mining policy framework in order to support governments in improving mining policy from an integrated perspective. So basically what that means is that IGF member states commit to 6 themes under the mining policy framework. And the 6 themes include 1, legal and policy financial benefit optimization, 3, socioeconomic benefit optimization, 4, environmental management, 5, post-mining transition, and 6, artisanal and small-scale mining. The IGF supports these countries in conducting an assessment with policy assessments have been completed to date in IGF member countries. And the top gaps that were found in regards to the policy assessment were in regards to post-mining, so remediation issues, socioeconomic issues, including, of course, gender, and ASM. And the IGF also conducts national and regional workshops and trainings to respond to in-country demands and provides technical assistance and guidance on topics including ASM, local content, and environmental and social impact assessments. So both of these organizations have agreed that on a common agenda, and that there's many key challenges that mining poses to sustainable development. So if you'll look at the figure on the slide, in particular, highlighted in the circle, it's recognized that mining can contribute to growing inequalities with different impacts for women and girls compared to men and boys. So IGF and UNDP agreed those governments' policy responses to these gender impacts and gaps could be strengthened. Both organizations also noted that gender is often not an explicit part of governance assessments, and therefore more awareness needs to be raised on how governments can address gender issues through policy and regulation. There was a significant interest from the member countries of IGF in regards to gender issues in mining, and the IGF and EGP therefore partnered on developing this gender training for this purpose. So as part of these efforts, enabling greater voice and participation, equity, women's empowerment, and community resilience has been prioritized. It's well established statistically that women and girls are more likely to suffer from the negative impacts related to mining, often due to existing structural inequalities. These disproportionate impacts may be in regards to exposure to water and land pollution, or lack of access to water and land. They may also be in regards to security, safety, and health threats related to increased populations of transient workers and job seekers, as sexual assaults. And finally, may be manifested in unequal access to the benefits of mining, whether that's in regards to employment or how mining revenues are reinvested in communities. There's a growing recognition of the need to invest in the development of policy, legal, and regulatory regimes that address the challenges facing the mining sector, and and how to better leverage the benefits in key areas such as gender equality and engaging women and men, boys and girls. There's an emerging consensus as well on the need to account for the differentiated impacts of natural resource policies on men and women, and to address the gender gaps that remain, and how policy design can change to address this. And finally, SDGs, and improve CG related to gender equality. It's essential to work with sectors such as mining, which can be transformative, which can have a transformative impact on a country's economy. So in order to start a substantive dialogue on these issues, UNDP's EGP, in partnership with IGF, hosted and facilitated an interactive session at IGF's AGM in Geneva last October, with more than 100 participants and people from 40 different countries. So this featured expert speakers on mining, on the technical aspects from Ministry of Mines, from Ministry of Gender, on mining governance, and breakout groups were formed from Africa, Latin America, Mongolia, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. Delegates were asked to discuss and rank what they viewed as the most pressing gender gaps and impacts related to mining, where governments could develop a response to these issues. Each group was given impact cards, which outlined common impacts in regards to gender and mining. And each group was then asked to discuss and rank each of the impacts from what they considered to be the most important to the least important. So this is something we can also discuss in our session after the webinar, your impressions on what some of the most important gender impacts are. But basically the top impacts ranked by the breakout groups were the following. It came out as lack of voice and participation in decision-making related to mining. The second was access to employment and as well as to basic education. The third was increased risk of gender-based violence. And the fourth was exposure to environmental contaminants. So from the session is that, you know, there was incredible engagement and interest of the participants, while it also revealed issues of somewhat low and significantly variable awareness of the full impacts described in the gender impact card. So, for example, participants demonstrated a limited awareness of several commonly recognized practitioners, and that includes health impacts such as, you know, a spike in the rate of STIs and HIV among the population, the transition to a cash economy, and as well as the pay scale gap, and all of these impacts disproportionately impact women in communities surrounding mine sites. So in regards to gender-based violence, it was also widely recognized as a key impact, but it wasn't necessarily linked to the use of security forces or the presence of temporary male-dominated workforces. Finally, although better participation of women in decision-making was signaled as a priority for improvement across the board, it was clear from the discussions that the dynamics related to participation were highly dependent on national context, from the local level to the decision-making level, and that participants required more awareness and guidance on best practice in regards to equitable participation. So based on these results, in the first, a gender and mining governance overview module, which gives a broader overview of gender issues in mining, a module on gender equitable participation, voice, and decision-making, as well as a module on gender-based violence. The training also includes ample opportunity for discussion, self-assessment, and case studies, and all of these can be tailored to the national context and to highlight examples of good practice, such as the ones we'll hear about today from Colombia. So today I'd like to focus briefly on the highlights of the module on participation, voice, and decision-making, as it's very relevant to the work being done in Colombia. The modules look at issues such as women's role in social license to operate and sustainability at the mine site and in surrounding communities. It also discusses existing inequalities in regards to compensation and benefits from mining. It highlights women's critical role in natural resource management and conflict resolution within communities, and it also outlines key steps in empowering women's voice and participation in the mining sector. So, as discussed previously, the modules also include many opportunities for reflection and discussion among participants. Several case studies are highlighted already throughout the training in order to share both what can go wrong when gender participation is lacking in a project, as well as cases in which robust engagement of women in decision-making and in the community consultations has led to improved outcomes. So here on the slide is an example of one such case study used in the training for the purposes of reflection and discussion. It basically outlines an issue that occurred on a mining project in Peru. The mining operation expansion threatened to remove rental residences, so there was involuntary displacement. The company arranged for compensation for the house owners in that area, but not for renters. So a group of renters who were mostly single women marched on the mine, and the company then had to go into a reactive mode with an immediate need to address and resolve the issue. So the participants are then encouraged to discuss and reflect on how the company could have handled the situation differently in the earlier stages of the project in order to minimize these negative effects on the renters and overall on the success of the project. So the key takeaway is that companies should undertake a gender inclusive baseline study, understand, for example, land use dynamics, marginalization in the area in depth, and so that they would have had a better understanding on the risk to the groups to the group of women and found a solution to compensate those marginalized women at the outset, avoiding protests and long delays, which can obviously be very disruptive to the community and cause large financial losses. So it's a classic example, this case study, of how better planning and assessment in early stages, if it's undertaken particularly in a socially conflict-sensitive and gender-sensitive and inclusive manner, it can have a significant impact on the delivery of a project. It's our hope that as the trainings are rolled out in various national contexts, we're able to share more experience from experts and practitioners, such as our colleagues presenting today, and you as people interested in governance and gender in mining. So overall, we've developed this training to be used in a flexible manner by key decision makers and practitioners in order to gain awareness and be able to develop practical tools and solutions to gender equity in the mining sector. Once the trainees have participated in the course, they should have gained capacity in the following areas. So gaining and keeping community support and the social license to operate, increasing efficiency in decision making, ensuring sustainability of community development, upholding global gender responsive principles such as the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as increasing efficiency in conflict resolution related to natural resource management. Well, our goal is also to ensure that practitioners are aware of the many excellent guidance documents which exist in regards to gender governance in the mining sector. And for this, we are working closely with other organizations. So there's, of course, UNDP guidance on this matter, but there's International Finance Corporation guidance, Oxfam, GIZ, and Publish What You Pay. Our next step in the development of the training is to hear from you regarding your views on both the delivery of the training and its content. So your responses to the questionnaire will be really, really useful. Following the webinar, we'll also have the opportunity to hold another interactive session at the IGF AGM in October. During the discussion portion of this webinar as well, at the end, it'll be very useful to kind of have your views based on some guiding questions. And so the guiding questions we have are: what type of gender impacts from mining have you come across in your work where governments have been struggling to formulate effective policy responses? The second question is, have you come across any effective or innovative policy approaches for mineral producing governments that have helped to address particular gender gaps that you think we should know about or highlight? And what's your experience and advice on piloting the gender and mining training, practical issues in terms of delivery content, especially targeting public sector agencies at the national and local levels, what I think we should take into account in those regards. So it's also worth mentioning, finally, that we have a piloting phase for the gender training, in which we'll roll out the modules that we've developed so far in the 4 current EGP countries. So that was Colombia, Kenya, Mozambique, and Mongolia. And finally, in order to continue and improve the training approach and content, as Sarah mentioned and as I mentioned, you'll receive the survey upon completion of the webinar to receive your input. So a huge thanks to all of you in advance for your contributions on that. And we're really looking forward to hearing your impressions, both in the discussion and as in response to the survey. And thanks so much for listening today. So Sarah will introduce the next speaker now.
For highlighting what some of the key components are of this new training, and also giving this overview of what some of the gender gaps that are most pressing and most important, and how governments might consider their policy responses to these. So I'd like to move on now. We're going to shift our focus specifically to the mining sector in Colombia, and how in Colombia, they've come to both understand particular gender issues that are most relevant and playing out in that situation, and how the government is responding to these. So I'd like to introduce the next speaker, and we will have my colleague, Felipe Lesmes Palacio from the UNDP office in Bogota, Colombia. He'll be presenting some information on behalf of one of our presenters who's not with us at this session, and that's Luisa Fernanda Baca. Ms. Baca is not present during the English session, but she will be presenting at the Spanish language version of this webinar this afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern. So Felipe will present on her behalf, and I will hand over the floor to Felipe to take this presentation forward.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. As Sarah was just telling you, I will be presenting or sharing with you the key points about the gender approach strategy from the Ministry of Mines. And since Luisa Fernanda Vaca, who is the chief of the Environmental and Social Affairs Office, is not with us on this session, but will be with us on the Spanish session later this afternoon. I think that any questions that you have or any comments that you have about this presentation, we could later share it with her, and that way you could have some of your questions answered by her directly. So to begin with, I want to highlight the importance of the mining, energy, and hydrocarbon sector in the country's economy. So for the last decade, these three areas have contributed to the Colombian GDP in about 9% average, with mining alone contributing between 2 to 3% to the GDP of the country. So such importance is reflected on the Colombian National Development Plan, which is the main instrument for the government to design and implement public policy, where the government sees the sector as a cornerstone for development in the regions. In this document, the government assumes the commitment to move forward with a second phase of the national public policy on gender equity in order to respond to international agreements and agendas. And that includes an entire component for the mining energy sector. So even though the energy mining sector is huge for the development and the economic growth of the country as a whole, and some of the poorest territories in particular, the growth of this sector also implies many social, cultural, and environmental transformations that need to be considered carefully to avoid and prevent conflicts locally, especially in the current context of the implementation of the peace agreements with the FARC guerrilla, where the mining, the illegal mining exploitation in some territories is becoming of very relevant cause of conflicts. So considering those transformations that the sector is having has implied also the recognition of the need to guide under a common scheme guidelines in matters of human rights and gender, and a minimum of actions that aim to address the main challenges in the field of energy mining activity. All of these taking into account that many practices within the sector are affecting vulnerable communities and have a negative impact on gender equality. Here we can take a look into some important figures that give us an idea of the sector. We saw that someone was already asking about the men-women ratio in the mining sector in the country. So here we can look that the sector has a low index of professionalization, with only the 2.7% of workers within the sector having finished a university degree. 3.5% have finished a program of technical education. 22% have achieved secondary school. 61% have finished primary school, and 9.8% are actually illiterate. On a different note, only 7% of all women within the sector perform executive duties, and more than 45% are working in operations. And 10.6% of the operations in the sector are performed by ethnic communities. Now, 5% of the women of the miners in the country are women, and men have higher salaries than women, up to 70% of difference. And one of the most serious problems in the sector is related to gender inequalities. Is that there is a high sexual violence index that is affecting reproductive and sexual rights, and that, as a consequence, is related to problems such as dissemination of sexually transmitted infections and teen pregnancy. This is all similar to what Sohini was telling us before. So Colombia is sharing all of these problems with other countries in a very similar way. And all of these problems are highlighted by the absence of general and updated data, which makes it difficult to identify risks, to characterize gender gaps, as well as indigenous communities and other population gaps, and to quantify the inclusion of the gender. So some of the dimensions that the national public policy on gender equity is trying to address are, on the one hand, the labor dimension, where it is looking for more and better direct and indirect jobs as a driver of development. There is also a community dimension where women tend to receive more risks than the benefits of the sector compared to men. And there is also an increase in gender violence. There is a lack of participation in prior consultations and an increase in the role of caterers and difficulties in access to water. So thus, for the Ministry of Mines and Energy, it is time to go from speech to action. They had been implementing some of these initiatives for the last 9 years. So between 2013 to 2017, the entity implemented 6 projects to reduce gender gaps, addressing the main problems of the sector that are negative for gender equity. They have implemented this dialogue about mining and women in the Amazonia. Let's talk about mining, it was called, where women in the region have been given a space to talk and discuss about their main concerns for the impacts of the sector on gender. The ministry has also developed a set of strategies for the prevention of gender-based violence in mining areas. They have been supported on these strategies by the Office of the President himself and the Office of the Gender Equity Advisor of the President. There has been also created the Ethics, Human Rights and Equity Committee with the duty, among others, of designing and implement public policies for the guarantee of gender equity. And they have adopted the national mining policy, which gives guidelines for the entire sector on gender. Other initiatives that the ministry has been implementing and that has been supported by international corporations is the implementation of a diagnosis on gender equality, and the ministry has received technical assistance for the inclusion of the gender approach within the human rights policy of the sector. All of this has come together to give like influence. Incomes for the creation or for the design of this the gender equity policy that the Ministry of Mines is designing since the end of the last year, which is including the role of a roadmap to formulate the entire gender equality policy, and which is expected to be implemented in 2020. So to summarize all of this, for the ministry and for the sector as a whole, these issues, the gender-related issues in the sector, is becoming a priority, and they have started to put all the information together, all the initiatives that they have been implementing for the last decade, all together into a single gender equity policy that they will be implemented in the next couple of years. Hopefully later this afternoon, all of the questions that you have or that you could have, or the comments and suggestions could be presented to the delegate of the Ministry of Mines and Energy, and they could be responded by them. So Sarah, go back to you.
Thank you, Felipe. We'll move on now. We'll remain in Colombia, but we will move into some particular approaches that have been taken to improve gender equity in mining regions of the country. And to do this, we have with us today Angela Maria Mesa, and she works for an NGO called the Alliance for Responsible Mining. Angela is an artisanal and small-scale governance professional and a lawyer, and she will be presenting a case and some experiences from the NGO perspective from the Alliance for Responsible Mining's work in Colombia. Before I hand the floor over to Angela, I would like to mention that she presents on behalf of the Alliance for Responsible Mining and also on behalf of the work of her colleague, Ander Arcos, who has worked extensively on some of the projects she will share with us. And Ander will also be presenting this work in the Spanish language webinar this afternoon. So Ander has extensive experience in international cooperation for development in Colombia and elsewhere. And he's also worked for multilateral organizations, including UNDP and NGOs. And he's a consultant for gender and mining in the Alliance for Responsible Mining. So Angela will present on behalf of her work at ARM and her colleague Ander, and I will now pass the floor over to you, Angela.
Okay, so hello. Well, how Sarah said, my name is Angela. I am National Governance Officer in Alliance for Responsible Mining, and also I am now the person who is responsible for gender and child labor strategies. So it's a pleasure to be here in this morning with all of you, and I am going to present you what is gender perspective in artisanal and small-scale mining, the mainstreaming of the gender approach that ARM has been implementing. So first of all, it's important that you know who is Alliance for Responsible Mining. We are an independent organization that works for a responsible and legitimate artisanal and small-scale mining, which promotes inclusive and sustainable development. We work through the empowerment of ASM miners, their organization, and the adoption of good practices, promoting an environment for their integration into the formal economy. We also develop voluntary standards of production and commercialization, supporting the creation of responsible supply chains. For example, we develop a standard for mines that recognize the best practices of ISM miners and connect them with international markets. We work in some countries around the world, like Colombia, Peru, Honduras, and now in Burkina Faso. And we born around 15 years ago. So first to talk with gender in ARM and ASM, it's necessary to clarify that gender gaps that affect mining sector in general are worse in artisanal and small-scale mining due to their particular situation of vulnerability and informality. So why did ARM begin to work with gender equity? While we were working with women, we realized that it was necessary to develop a transversal gender approach where we could understand the gender gaps in ASM sector. And with that information, we could propose positive actions to close those gaps. Our efforts requires a deeper analysis since ASM sector has a lot of gender violence and inequities. So in that sense, we decided to make a transition from a women for development approach to a gender for development approach. The difference is that women for development approach only focus in the empowerment of women, considering that is the better way to reduce gender gaps, but this approach don't consider gender relations. That's why when we talk about a transversal gender approach, we refer to analysis how these gender relations are expressed in the ASM sector, and how these roles are associated stereotypes are reflected in cases of discrimination and violence. Our Gender for Development approach is related to the impacts of the theory of change in ARM. So we work for the welfare of people, plus the protection of the environment, plus a strong and inclusive economies, and these items are achieved through gender equity in 4 lines. First, equality in human rights. Second, gender equity in access to mining resources and opportunities. Third, gender equality in political participation, leadership and decision making, and prevention and attention to gender violence in the mining sector. We recognize that women are the most vulnerable group because of historical discrimination and power relation, but we also analyze if gender gaps affect other population groups, like new ways of understand the masculinity or how these gaps affect men in such a way that men are agents of change or inclusion. So as an organization, we have a transformation strategy in 3 lines, which become our priority. First, improvement of organizational practices in ARM with gender approach. We think that it's necessary to lead by example to have a gender equality management system that improve internal condition of ARM in terms of gender equity. Then use this system as a model to implement in ASM organizations. Second, development of a gender equality strategy in ASM. We realized that there wasn't enough information about gender in ASM sector. We knew certain types of vulnerabilities and discrimination against women, but it was not enough. So it was necessary to realize an analysis of gender gaps in ASM to understand the inequalities and the real situation of that issue. Then we begin to search for funds for new specialized projects for gender equality in mining. There is the mainstream and the gender approach in new projects and a creation and piloting of strategies, methodologies, and specific tools for gender equality in mining. Then, once the problem has been understood, a logic of intervention has been developed from the search of funds to implementation. Then we talk about political incidents for more equitable ASM. We made some recommendations for the public policy recommendations for gender equality in mining in Colombia. And we have the approach of ASM sector that is different from big mining, for example. So in all of this process, we are looking for 6 results that are integrated to our projects, including for mine and craft. So first, women and miners sensitized in gender equity, women miners with voice, participation, and leadership in ASM and their communities, women and men miners trained and with tools for gender equity in ASM miners and gender equity without discrimination and gender violence, women miners more resilient and less vulnerable socially and economically. This result is very broad because it implies that women have economic autonomy and capacity to respond to gender violence, and political action and institutional strengthening for an ASM with gender equity. So those results require some activities or priority actions to be achieved. Those actions are: make visible and dignify the work of women miners at the political level, their communities, and in front of public opinion. We encourage women to participate in those spaces and talk about their necessities with property and proud. Second, prioritize the education and training of women miners, considering as the opportunity to improve their condition and capacities. Sensitize communities and especially children and young people about gender equity. It should be included in public courses and programs. It is important for us that the entire community can break gender stereotypes and be more inclusive in their decisions. Promote the associations among women miners. It helps to work towards economic improvements and as a platform to defend and claim their rights. integrate men minors in the sensitization and the positive action plans so that they can be allies in the process. This is a change of approach where men minors can change the conception of women in mining by themselves. This awareness is carried out without judgment, simply showing the benefits of a more inclusive mining. For example, showing that this culture has emotional discrimination for men and that can end with this approach. Promote policies, procedures, and protocols aimed at integrating gender equity in ASM in general and for the prevention and elimination of gender violence. This is how a particular organization, ASM organization, can have policies addressed to gender equality. Promote models of social and economic solidarity in ASM that have gender equity as a value and a principle. The main example of this is what Fairmined certification do, because Fairmined mines should have a gender approach included of their programs, and participation in advocacy spaces for more equitable ASM. So with all of this, we have a case study that is a project called Proud Women Miners, en español, Orgullosamente Mineras. It was a project for the empowerment of women miners and the promotion of gender equity in ASM sector in the province of Tugamix, Boyacá, through the creation and startup of an association of women miners. ARM, Alliance for Responsible Mining, with funding from the Canadian Fund for Local Initiatives, since 2018 has worked with a group of women miners and porters from the municipalities of Monguagame, Sogamoso, and Topaga, with the aim of promoting the empowerment and participation of women in mining sector through an association of women miners that allows women to mobilize to achieve a more responsible, fair, and equitable mining. So this project has 223 people benefit between men and women, and the association is organized with 65 women coal miners, porter, and SENA students. So these have some achievements that are what you have seen in this moment. There are creation and strengthening of the Association of Women Mining for political, sectorial, and community advocacy purposes. For example, we help them to the conformation of a board of directors and a sustainability and work plan. Individual and collective empowerment of the mining women's group. The main idea is that women are empowered and have gender tools, even if they don't belong to the association. Design development of participatory piloting of tools for gender equity in mining. For example, we designed a guide for a women miner empowered that has recommendation to prevent and eliminate discrimination and gender violence. Also, we have a gender equity management system for mining organizations and another tools to know the level or the grade of violence or discrimination that someone could feel in a mining context. Sensitization and training in gender equity for men and women miners, trainings in mining and gender stereotypes, participatory creation of tools for gender equality, working with local actors to advance in gender equity in mining, for example, with SENA, its National Service for Learning, for trainings in mining security and health, and participation of women miners in advocacy spaces and exchange with other miners. For example, women from Department of Cauca visit women from Boyacá and they share their different ways that they are organized and how they work. It is important because they are motivated to implement best practices. So this is a quickly example of how we can implement gender equity in ASM sector. We hope this could be replied in future projects because we think that it's possible to have a gender equity for miners. So thank you very much for your attention this morning.
Thank you very much, Angela. It's very interesting to hear about the work of ARM at the policy level, direct interventions to strengthen participation of women miners, and as well addressing specific issues such as violence. So we will move on to our final case presentation, and that is Javier Blanco. So Javier will now be looking at the Chaco region of Colombia, and Javier will present to us a project in that region. We will consider gender participation issues a little bit more from an ecosystem perspective, given that in this area there are multiple pressures on a very rich biodiverse area, including those that come from mining as well as other sectors. So taking us through this case study is Javier Blanco. Javier is a sustainability specialist. He works on inclusive environmental governance. Javier serves as a field officer at the UN Women Office in Chaco, Colombia. And his project focuses on women's empowerment in natural resource decision-making, as well as on the protection of environmental and human rights defenders. We've also had the pleasure of having Javier work with us previously at the Environmental Governance Program, and I've worked with him myself, so he has a lot of real investment into these topics, and if you ever have a chance to work with him, it's great. So we look forward to hearing about the work they've been doing recently in Chaco at the UN Women's Office. And the floor is now over to you, Javier.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm glad to be here to be able to share this conversation with the other presenters, with people attending this webinar. And so thanks to everyone for being here. And I would like to add to these two previous presentations the case study from Choco, from my current experience in the field. Which you might notice is a bit different from the cases presented before. This is a bit more landed, it's a bit more specific. So what I'm going to be presenting is a pilot project, which is basically a case study that deals with women, environmental governance, and peacebuilding in Chaco, and its relation to natural resources management and environmental governance. This pilot project is a pilot project that comes from a global project that is on women and peacebuilding, that is from UN Women, UN Environment, and UNDP. Needless to say, in this case, Choco is a department in Colombia, in the Pacific region, is the only department that is, although it's mostly Pacific and it's considered Pacific culturally, it also has some parts of it in the Caribbean, in the north, and it's connected to Panama. The Choco bioregion is one of the, biodiversity-wise, is one of the most diverse in the world, and is one of the most water-rich and humid places in the world. So to put a bit of a context of Choco, and in the project, we would have to say that this project is a 2-year project that goes through from 2017 to 2019. It's mostly in Choco. That's what I'm going to be speaking about. But it's also it has also some activities in Bajo Cauca Antioqueño, in Antioquia department, and national level activities as well. And their donors are Norway, Finland, and Germany. So landing here in Choco, which is basically the most of it that is covered by this project, one could say. We could be speaking of the context, the development context of Choco. This could be a 1-hour presentation just on this slide, but I'll try to be brief. So Choco has 3 main challenges, or 3 main aspects that highlight its specific development context. One is the economic, social, environmental vulnerabilities. In the negative side, Choco has near 80% unsatisfied needs, comparing to nearly 30% of the average in Colombia. The poverty rate is next to 70%, and the multidimensional poverty, which is a combination of health, education, and living standards, is 97% of the population. There's also, when it comes to social vulnerabilities, there's the conflicts, armed conflicts. Although FARC have stopped their activities due to the peace agreements, there are many other groups that are still active and increasingly violent in the region. So the second aspect that has to do with how Chocó can be defined is how connectivity and rurality has a new level, goes a bit beyond other cases. This is a rainforest, but at the same time, it feels like an archipelago in the sense that one needs to move by boat to most places in the department. There are only two main roads, one to Pereira and another to Medellin. And roads, rivers serve as roads. These means that a lot of communications, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of emergency, a lot of security issues are a bit slower and depend on not having heavy rains, on moving by day, and so on. Another aspect, in this case very positive, or it could be a very positive driver for development, is its cultural and natural richness. Cultural because it's an Afro and indigenous mix. Afro is nearly 80% of the population, and indigenous is nearly 13% of the population. The rest are something called, it's an ethnicity called mestizo, which is this Latin mix that happens in many countries. And natural resources is because, as I previously mentioned, this is a like water rich, biodiversity rich, wood rich, rainforest rich area. And in this case, 24% of gold that is produced in Colombia comes from Chocó, and 94% of platinum that Colombia produces comes from Chocó. The thing here, and this is connecting to the vulnerabilities, is that 86% of the gold that gets out of Chocó, out of Colombia, is extracted illegally, and Chocó is no exception to that, which leads to other problems, that minerals are being extracted, but not everyone is benefiting from that, and there are many side effects from that kind of extraction that has to do with pollution, with financing of armed groups, with informal economies, and so on. So when UN Women focused on Chocó, it wanted also to focus thematically, and one of the many aspects that we could pick up was environmental governance, and this had two main openings in Chocó. One was the ruling T622 from the Constitutional Court that recognizes the Atrato River as a subject to rights. Among that, it also states that there should be economic recovery, elimination of illegal mining, there should be a promotion of sustainable lifestyles, and there are many organizations that have been given a mandate to implement this, national and local level organizations, among them the Ministry of Environment, the local governments, and so on, and local corporations that had to do with environmental protection. So this is an opening because it's the Constitutional Court giving a mandate to a lot of organizations. So working towards that is working towards something that Colombia as a country has already agreed on. But connected to this is that environmental activists and human rights defenders are usually not included in decision-making spaces. And this has not only to do with representation, it also has to do with protection issues and threats. So for example, as a whole in Colombia, just in 2018, there has been 155 deaths to human rights defenders. One has to say that environmental defenders are human rights defenders, just for the rights of a clean and safe environment. And in Chocó last year, there were 5 people killed like that. But overall in Chocó, there have been 687 victims from threats, displacement, confinement, and deaths. And and over 4,000 in Colombia as a whole. So considering these mandates that the ruling creates, plus the need to protect these human rights defenders, and especially women human rights defenders, environmental defenders, that's where we focus on. So the project aims at as a concept, we were mentioning women, natural resources, and we've mentioned both, and peace building. So where is the peace building aspect here? In this case, peace building has to do with a concept that is called territorial peace. Territorial peace is a very Colombian concept that is not just about the ending of an armed conflict. It also has to do with a sustainable peace, where conflicts are transformed political, socially, economically, and culturally to achieve harmony, both social and environmental. This means that we need sustainable development. This territorial peace would mean implementing SDG 16 about peaceful societies, but also all the SDGs to maintain it and avoid future conflicts that might come from environmental governance or other type of social problems. So in this sense, and talking about the Atrato River and so on, from our projects, participants in our project identified what a river is. And in this case, a river in Chocó, and in this case, Atrato, is not just a moving body of water. It's a communication mechanism. As we said before, this is like an archipelago, so this is a communication mechanism. It's part of the territory, it's part of the lifestyle, it's part of the roots to a place. It's part of identity to peoples, especially to indigenous, but also to Afro communities. In here, we have to mention also that, like most land in Chocó, it's collective property, meaning that it belongs to ethnic groups as collective, and they have to decide what type of activities are taking place in those areas. And a river is also culture. Of course, a river is also an ecosystem, a very unique ecosystem that is threatened. In this case, is threatened by pollution, either by plastic pollution, but especially by mercury pollution, and all the type of outputs that come from mining, especially illegal mining. So to focus a bit more of what we're doing on the project. So the project has three main components. One is institutional capacities strengthening. So there has to be the Atrato River implementation. So there are many government organizations that have to take place in this. So we want to support them to have enough capacities to implement this ruling. We also want to empower civil society organizations, especially women's organizations, in taking part on this sustainable environmental governance. And since this is a pilot project, we want to gather and disseminate best practices from this project. But these components are taken as a process that starts as a capacity building process with 25 I'm gonna say that on quotes, guardians of the Atrato. On this, I have to say that the Atrato River has already appointed formally 14 guardians of Atrato for implementing the ruling. But there's also a big body of people who support those 14 focal points. So we started this capacity building with some of those 14 people, but also with some other people that will support this process. So with this process, which is a training, they also receive training on conflict identification, conflict analysis, conflict resolution, and political incidents. So they can do some advocacy to frame environmental protection as something positive towards development. This process, there are some other processes that have to do with women environmental defenders, exchanging experiences at the national level from women from other places, and also participating in decision-making spaces provided by, for example, the Ministry of Environment. At the end of this, we are compiling and documenting and disseminating best practices from all this process. So to do this, we got in contact and we worked along national level NGOs, mainly Tierra Digna, which was the organization that worked on making the ruling of Atrato River possible. They were the ones working in court for that. Also with Fundación Natura, they work supporting us mostly at national level events, especially exchanges between different environmental defenders. We are in contact and working with the Ministry of Environment, supporting different dialogue spaces within Chocó and elsewhere. And apart from the three UN agencies mentioned before, UN Women, UN Environment, and UNDP, we are also working with UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, especially on the training that has to do with human rights and self-protection for environmental defenders. So when we work with these organizations, we involve women from several civil society organizations in Chocó, be them this interethnic group forum, that is the Forum Fish, that is a mix of indigenous and Afro communities. We are working also with local Afro communities within Chocó. We are also working with indigenous communities, with women's groups, and so on. So in this case, mentioning that we're working on implementing a ruling that has to do with mining, but not only with mining. We would have to say that from this project, social environmental issues in Chocó go beyond mining issues and are multifaceted, meaning mining that has different perspectives. There is legal mining, but there is also illegal mining. Territorial peace needs inclusive environmental governance. In this sense, we can't achieve territorial peace just by stopping violence that comes from armed groups. We need to know and to make sure that the river is not polluted, that people have sustainable lifestyles, that there is no gender violence, that women are key players in natural resource decision-making and peace building. This means that women are often excluded from these spaces, and when they are involved, they face additional risks from the ones that men face that come from their communities, but even from the private spaces. In this sense, we want to empower them. So peace includes gender issues. Otherwise, it won't achieve territorial peace. It would be probably temporary peace. And to wrap up on this, the Atrato ruling is a very nice entry point and a good opportunity for this project to advance and to bring this conversation of empowering women and empowering women, promoting peace building and promoting environmental conservation in Chocó. So with that, I thank you for your time. Thank you for listening, and I will be open for any question that you might have.
Thank you very much, Javier. It's very interesting to go dig a little deeper into a local situation and to understand the linkage between a lack of ability to participate and where there are poor practices of environmental governance, that this can potentially increase conflict risks, and these risks in Chocó are very, and as well as other places, are very real. So thank you for sharing that, as well as helping us understand how participation in decision-making around natural resources can cross sectors. It can be affected by mining, but also other sectors at the same time, which is important to keep in mind. So now is the time in the webinar where I'd like to thank all the presenters. I think we've heard some very interesting cases and insights from the level of what the challenges are globally to what some of the policy responses are in Colombia, all the way to what are some practical interventions that are making a difference for gender equity in in artisanal and small-scale mining, as well as in particular regions. So now is the time when all of you participating, we have a good number of participants from many countries, have the opportunity to ask questions and discuss what we've heard from our 4 speakers and perhaps how this links to your work. So please feel free now to share your questions in the chat window, or you may raise your hand in the control panel of GoToWebinar. And if you'd like to speak to ask your question directly and your connection allows it, if you raise your hand, we can open your microphone during the Q&A, but I will also be reading questions on your behalf as well, with some assistance from colleagues. So please feel free to type out your question in the chat window or to raise your hand and ask. I will get started with a question for Angela. My question for you is, you mentioned that there were artisanal and small-scale mining public policy recommendations that had come from the work that ARM has done. I wonder if you could share with us a little bit more about what these recommendations were. And if you would like to answer if you'd like to prefer to respond in Spanish, Martin can assist with translation, or in English is okay too. So I put that question to Angela to get us started with the discussion.
Okay, now, yes, it's better for me to answer in Spanish, okay? It's fine for you?
We just ask that you speak in some short sentences and then allow Martin to translate, and then you can continue. Is that okay?
Okay, perfect.
Go ahead.
Bueno, entonces, realmente lo que hicimos fue enviar recomendaciones para la política de género que está haciendo el Ministerio de Minas con enfoque de minería artesanal y a pequeña escala. En este sentido, podría compartir con ustedes las recomendaciones que hicimos, que son varias, pero nuestro enfoque está orientado a que esta política tenga en cuenta que para el sector de minería artesanal y a pequeña escala es necesario un enfoque diferencial que involucre toda la cantidad de aristas y diferentes enfoques que debe tener un sector que ha sido tradicionalmente no solo discriminado, sino también informal. En ese sentido, hablamos que es necesario promover la asociatividad entre las mujeres mineras que hay en el país, que hay en Colombia, por ejemplo. Nuestra idea era incluso crear una red nacional de mujeres mineras. Otra de las propuestas que tenemos es, pues que hicimos a esta política, es que se generen espacios de educación para cualificar la mano de obra de la mujer minera en pequeña minería. Otra es que se analicen, por ejemplo, los casos de titulación que se están haciendo a mujeres, que eso se pueda discriminar en algún momento en razones bueno, en este momento de sexo, pero que se pueda hacer en algún momento por género. Entonces, otro de los puntos que promovíamos era regular y promover exigencia de sistemas de gestión para la equidad de género con enfoque MAPE, que se tengan los requisitos diferenciales adaptados a las escalas de minería. En Colombia existe el sello Equipares, entonces que con estrategias diferenciales de sensibilización y comunicación se dirijan esta información a la pequeña escala. Que se desarrollen acciones concretas orientadas a aumentar la participación de la mujer en el sector minero, promoviendo tanto pues, su inclusión como en actividades calificadas como no cualificadas. Que se eliminen las barreras existentes en la contratación de mujeres mineras, buscando pues como eliminar ese estigma que existe entre el sector masculino o sector femenino y modificar esa división sexual del trabajo que ha tenido el sector minero. Y para ello se buscan mecanismos de transparencia. No. Hola.
¿Me escuchan?
Sí.
Excelente, es que tenía un problema. Ángela, te voy a dejar terminar y después vamos a hacer un resumen para que yo pueda traducir.
Ok. Entonces, exigir mecanismos de transparencia en la contratación que eliminen la discriminación existente. Es necesario también que a nivel gubernamental se empiece a habilitar el papel de la mujer minera en los medios de comunicación, con el fin de como dignificar esta labor y normalizar su participación. Tiene un rol central el gobierno en este sentido en articulación de medios de comunicación públicos y privados. Y eso además genera que se haga con un enfoque de vulnerabilidad no solo a mujeres que son técnicas, sino a las mujeres de subsistencia que tienen un rol central en las economías familiares de los municipios. Todos estos que estamos hablando tienen que ser tenidos con un enfoque de vulnerabilidad para que a la hora de implementar acciones se tenga como el principio de acción sin daño, que no vayamos a causar o que institucionalmente no se cause un daño peor. Promover también el tema de la educación en equidad de género a los hombres que trabajan en minería y como lo comentaban a nivel comunitario para que todas las personas estén en capacidad de romper esos esquemas de género que tiene el sector minero. Implementar también programas diferenciados para para mujeres mineras de subsistencia, dirigidos no solo a la reconversión laboral, sino a incluirlos integralmente en una política de formalización minera, reconociéndoles las necesidades que tienen en materia de seguridad social, por ejemplo, que es una gran brecha a la hora de continuar elaborando o que se ve afectado, por ejemplo, el caso de que la mamá se enferma, son madres cabeza de familia y ya deben enviar a sus hijos entonces, por ejemplo, a trabajar, lo que sería también una estrategia enfocada a erradicación de trabajo infantil.
Te detengo, Ángela. Vamos a tratar de resumir para que yo pueda traducir ahora que ya tengo el control del micrófono. Thanks everyone for listening, Ángela. We will sum up and we will translate for you all. Ángela, ¿cuáles serían, en tu opinión, de todo lo que acabas de mencionar, las 4 o 5 puntos más importantes?
Listo. Hagámoslo en 5 puntos. La primera es promover sistemas de gestión para la equidad de género con enfoque diferencial.
Okay, the first recommendation is to promote systems of gender, let's say responsiveness, gender equality, with that takes into account differentiated approaches for women and men.
La segunda es que la política desarrolle acciones concretas orientadas a aumentar la participación de la mujer en la minería con enfoque diferencial para pequeña y mediana y minería de subsistencia.
Okay. The second is to mainstream policies that take into account the participation of women and differentiated participation of women in a small and medium scale mining activities.
Tercera, visibilizar el papel de la mujer minera en medios de comunicación a fin de dignificarlas y normalizar la participación que estas mujeres tienen.
Make it evident the participation of women in the mining sector and mining activities, just to take out this invisibility role and dignify and normalize the participation of women in the mining sector and mining activities.
La cuarta diría que es desarrollar un censo minero con enfoque de género que incluya cifras desagregadas por sexo en las diferentes escalas mineras, con la finalidad de identificar las formas de participación de la mujer en la actividad y la necesidad de políticas diferenciales.
Is developing a census so we will be aware of the participation of women in the different stages of the mining process and at different scales, so we can implement differentiated policies oriented to attend the women's sector in the mining industry.
Y la última es que esta política incluya programas diferenciados para mujeres mineras de subsistencia, que son en muchos casos madres cabeza de familia y tienen una desprotección laboral demasiado grande en temas de seguridad y salud en el trabajo.
And finally, to make sure that policy includes measures to take into account the conditions of women that in many cases are heads of the family, and they are vulnerable in terms of health and other essential services. So make sure that the policy recognizes and includes some affirmative actions to close the gap and eliminate the vulnerability.
Listo.
Thank you,
Angela. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Martin, for the translation. And thanks for our participants in the audience for being patient with their questions. I see we have questions coming in quickly, so we will try to address as many as we can. I'd like to pose a question or a couple of questions to Sohini. Sohini, a question came in on the chat, and I will relay it to you. Also, other panelists, please feel free to also contribute your response, but we'll start with Sohini. So the first question is, in your view, to what extent we've heard a number of examples from Colombia, and to what extent are the issues brought up specific to the mining sector? Are these issues actually more general throughout the country and perhaps in other countries? How would you interpret whether these issues are specific to mining or whether they cross sectors, and how we can understand that? So that's one question. Another related question that I would like to pass on as well is, now that we know there's growing economic empowerment in the mining sector, and recently there have been emerging more sustainable practices in the sector, and the question is, have these practices motivated more involvement for women? If so, how? And if not, why not? So we'll start with you, Sohini, and if other presenters would like to add, we can do that once you finish answering. So please go ahead.
Okay, thanks so much, Sarah, for relaying the question, and thanks to the person that asked it. I think, you know, it's a great question because clearly some of the issues we've heard about today more broadly, and then in the context Colombia, and even at the local project or regional level, they clearly point to certain structural differences in equity and more broad issues that are cross-sector in terms of the safety of environmental defenders, for example. Exposure to environmental contamination, of course, can also be in the oil and gas sector. It can be in other related sectors. There's serious problems in Colombia and many countries with land conflict, whether that's directly with the state, whether it's between communities and armed groups. And so certainly there are cross-cutting broader gender issues and political issues and economic issues that have led to these specific impacts within the mining sector. So yes, in some sense, I would say many of the issues that we're talking about certainly cross sectors, and as I pointed out, kind of deal with larger structural issues in terms of gender equity, and at the global level, but at the national level and at the regional levels. But I think specifically in the mining sector, there are certain types of engagement throughout the project cycle that occur that can certainly be strengthened, keeping in mind those structural differences. And that's what we're trying to emphasize, and understanding as well, specific impacts. For example, we've heard a lot about artisanal and small scale mining today. Felipe, I believe you pointed out that, very high proportion of small scale miners are women, but then at the executive level, for example, in decision making on large scale mining projects, women's participation tends to be very low. So I think it's really important, as Angela also just pointed out, that we have kind of more refined and fine data about what the impacts are at different types of, in different regions, at different types of mining projects, and what the understanding the gender dynamics that are caused as well, not just because of overall structural context, but due to mining projects. So how mining projects themselves are affecting conflict, inequality, forced displacement, the dynamics around environmental defenders. So there's a huge explosion in Colombia and many countries around the world in mining projects that also often leads to an explosion in ASM. And what that does is, as Javier pointed out, just as the issues, and I believe Angela as well, the issues in ASM tend to be even stronger and exacerbated because of structural issues due to marginalization in those communities. I would say that's the same case for mining and large-scale investments in countries, is that there may be structural differences that already exist, and then large investments, the temporary workforces that come, the changes in economies that come, the changes to the environment that come, exacerbate those gender inequalities and differences. And that's why I think a lot of these lessons are transferable to other sectors, certainly, but certainly the focus on mining gender governance is really important because it shapes the economy of many countries. So that's please feel free if you have if I didn't quite answer your question, or if you have further questions in that regard, please feel free to keep them coming in. And now to address the second question, Sarah, I'll just repeat it. Let me know if I got it right. You're saying that there's growing economic empowerment in the mining sector, and many practices that have been highlighted, both today or that attendees are familiar with. You're asking whether those have motivated more involvement of women, or kind of how effective they've been. And I think to address that, I would say, there's certainly a lot of interesting initiatives. For example, Javier spoke about this Women in Peacebuilding initiative that's been undertaken by UNDP and UNEP and UN Women. I think, there's a growing recognition that, for example, women have a critical role in natural resource management and peace-building initiatives, in community conflict resolution. And I would say my experience, both in the field, I worked for many years on, both for governments and for private sector on corporate social responsibility initiatives and community development around mining sites and human rights assessments. I think the amount of guidance has certainly increased. There's been some good initiatives. I think in concrete terms, there's been a lot of now newer examples of best practice, of success in women being incorporated. But I think there's still a huge gap and a lot of work to be done. So yes, I think it has motivated more involvement of women. But as I'm sure many of the people participating today recognize, there's a lot of different interlinked political initiatives that have to go forward for real participation and real equality in terms of representation in decision making, for example. And I think by kind of highlighting these best practices that we've heard about today, by sharing them with other countries, by sharing them with other regions within the same country, I think we can continue that trend towards better participation. And certainly in terms of just focusing on employment and economic empowerment, I mean, there's been huge strides forward in many countries in terms of women's participation in various sectors of the workforce, and that's very inclusive of mining. However, we still do see very much a change in the types of work, so maybe women are working more in certain countries, but they may still be very much underrepresented in decision-making levels, or they have very specific tasks in the supply chain. So yes, certainly economic empowerment and recognition of participation has led to positive changes, and there's lots of great initiatives. I think it's about now applying more, showing those initiatives more broadly so that there's greater uptake, and also, like I said earlier, there's a lot of great guidance. I think it's about now developing awareness within, ministries of mines and ministries of gender as well on sector-specific impacts, ministries of environment, so that when they're reviewing environmental and social impact assessments. They're also best able to judge the robustness of those assessments in regards to say, gender and human rights by a more nuanced awareness of those impacts. So I hope I answered your question there, and I'd love to hear from other speakers as well if they have anything to add on that, on those 2 points.
Thank you, Sohini. Did any of the other speakers want to contribute a point on either of those 2 questions? If not, we do have many other questions coming in from our participants, so I will, I'll just say what we'll do in the next few minutes. So we have a question for Javier specifically about the Chaco project. So Javier will be up next to answer that. After that, I have several questions that have come in through the chat that are in regards to evaluation, developing indicators to measure progress. So I'll pose those questions. We have several to Angela, Javier, and also to Sohini. But first, and then we will go to some of the folks who have their hands raised. So thank you for your patience. If you have your hands raised, we will come to you. Fortunately, we have a good amount of time to have our discussion. So first, Javier, on the Chaco project, the question is, did you face any opposition from Indigenous and Afro communities in the capacity building of women's empowerment? And how do you take into account their approaches and ideas about the environment and their ancestral culture?
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I think that's a great question. And that's a very relevant question for the context of Chaco, given the ethnic background of and the ethnic profile of that department. So regarding opposition from those groups, so the way the project was designed was kind of backwards. So we started from what would be interesting for people from those communities. So we engaged with mainly with the national level NGOs, and with them we engaged with the local NGOs and local groups that are representatives of Afro and Indigenous communities. And then we identified the methodology, the people to include in that process, and the attempted results of the project. So we started from there. So so the groups themselves provided the people and invited the people that would be participating in the process that is our project. So in that sense, we did not face opposition. We rather faced support, and we faced an increased demand for similar initiatives within the department. So given that this pilot project goes well in the end and so on, which is going well so far, we are trying to learn from what we have and trying to design systems to how to replicate this kind of trainings, how to replicate this kind of support to the empowerment of women in the implementation of the Atrato ruling and the protection of environmental defenders. But the reason why we didn't face opposition is because it was not designed top down from an office somewhere near Europe or even in Bogota. It was designed asking first the organizations in Choco and arranging the results with them.
Thank you very much, Javier. I have a question, an additional question that is directed towards you and to Angela. So perhaps first you can respond and then we can have Angela's input on the same question. And that is, have you done an evaluation of the results of the project, and how do you evaluate the impact of this peace building project on women and their participation? So first Javier and then Angela talking about evaluation on ARMS project. Go ahead, Javier.
So thank you, and that's also a very relevant question, given the peace building is hard to measure, in the sense that impact on peace building is hard to measure. We might be contributing, we hope we are contributing to peace building, but when we see also an increase in armed conflicts, it's hard to measure how much this is going counter to that trend. So the way we are measuring that is how many women in the logical framework. It would be how many women are participating. What's the increase of women participating in these spaces, in this decision-making spaces when it comes to environmental governance, and how much those decision-making spaces contribute to reduce this kind of it's not necessarily violence, but it's like disagreements, issues that have to do with land governance. So in that sense, the fact that we are acting on people on participants that will replicate within their communities, empowers their communities, and initiatives coming from the participants involved in our project have direct impact on those communities. And we are designing a way of replicating, so the people who came to their communities can also teach and expand that kind of work within their within additional communities, nearby communities. In that sense, creating a network of people supporting this empowerment of women on decision making on natural resource management. So the end result would be how many people, apart from the 25 initial, are being extended, how much did the network grew and how much articulated that is. We still don't have definite figures on that. Definitely we have 25 people plus the organizations that they work with. So, but we need to still measure at the end of the project how many more people are considering themselves, how many women are considering themselves environmental defenders, Atrato ruling supporters, and Atrato guardians, quote unquote. We still have to define that figure because the communities themselves have to provide that for us.
Thank you, Javier. We'll move on to the next question, and if Angela would like to respond, please, let us know with a message, and we will come back to you. But we do have a couple of other questions that are also related to this same topic of how you monitor these impacts of peace building, what type of indicators you can use. So we will go back to Sohini to ask some questions about measurement, because I know this is an area that you work in. And also Felipe, if you have some points you'd like to add, please do so. So these are two questions. The first one is that given historical weak implementation of access to information and participation policies within the mining sector, what steps are needed to ensure these policies around voice and participation will be implemented, and how do we measure progress? So this is a question from Elizabeth Moses in the chat on how we measure progress. There's a second question that's related that I'd like to ask at the same time. To what extent do local governments use or adopt global tools to promote sustainable development under the 2030 Agenda, specifically on SDG number 5 on gender equality? Is there a tracking mechanism to track efforts and report on them in countries' sustainable SDG reports? So, Sohini, perhaps we start with you. I know you worked on evaluation around SDGs before, so if you could address those two questions, and then Felipe, I know you've also gave this some consideration from the office in Bogota. If you have any comments, please add them. So over to Sohini.
Thanks a lot, Sarah, for the question, for relaying the question. Again, I think it's a very pertinent question where we have a lot of interest here around how to track progress, and I assume because many practitioners attending this webinar already are looking at interesting initiatives at the national level. Implementation. It's been a huge global effort to kind of determine, rational targets and indicators. I think, a really key point there, which is related to what Angela said in her presentation, is that, you know, often we have a lack of baseline information at the local level. So that could, more and more we have in terms of, for example, gender participation in the workforce, gender representation at political levels, but that doesn't always necessarily translate down to what the regional baseline is, what that gender participation looks like at the project site. And so I think, you know, the first step in developing better indicators and targets and measuring progress is supporting initiatives at getting better baseline data so that we can have more rational targets and indicators. I certainly think another really related question is, you know, certainly there are issues around transparency, and initiatives such as, you know, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative are working towards decreasing some of those major gaps. But I certainly think that not necessarily just relying on local government agencies or national ministries is important if sometimes violations in participation, or clearly, you know, the issue of environmental defenders, attack and security of environmental defenders has come up. I think one way to kind of ensure better access to information, better participation, and as well as to have really kind of information is also to empower civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations that are working in those regions and on those sites. So, you know, again, better third-party monitoring of participation and access, and making sure that those are also kind of integrated into the planning and policy tools that the government uses, such as environmental and social impact assessment. Felipe, maybe I'll leave the second part of the question to you on tracking mechanisms at the country level on SDGs, because I assume that you're probably working on some of that at UNDP in Colombia.
Thank you, Sohini. And to Felipe, I'll just repeat the question we received. To what extent do local governments utilize or adopt tools to promote sustainable development under Agenda 2030, in particular to reach SDG 5 on gender equality? Is there a tracking mechanism for the efforts and to report on them in country SDG reports?
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for the question. Actually, we at the UNDP office here in Colombia, we are helping the local governments to develop that kind of mechanisms. The national government has actually been very strong, you know, in developing these kind of mechanisms to follow up how the implementation of the SDGs in the country are being carried on. But in the local governments, it's not the same. It's not happening at the same pace. So from the national government, you have a lot of different tools. You have an entire system where you can track what is happening for any of the SDGs. But for the local governments, that is something that they still need to develop. And we, from the UNDP country office, we are helping them to realize how the SDGs, specifically this SDG, the SDG on gender equality and many of the SDGs related to environment, could be achieved in a better way if they, on the one hand, if they develop mechanisms to track how their public policies are contributing to the achieving of the goals, but how the inclusion of the SDGs under public policy documents, such as the development plans, the municipalities and the departments' development plans, could also help them to achieve the goals in a better way. I think that we are in the country, we still need to work on how to bring all these tools that the national government has already developed to the local governments. But that's still that is something that we are definitely doing, and that it's something that could be replicated as an experience in other countries.
Thank you very much, Felipe. So a bit of a snapshot on how countries can report on particular SDG targets. So next, we are going to revisit the question that was posed to Angela about evaluating the impacts of arms projects on women. Our colleague Martin has had the chance to receive her answer in writing and translate, so I will pass the floor to Martin to do that.
Thank you, Sarah. And Angela apologizes because she has no access to the microphone now. She wrote to me and said that they conducted a participatory assessment of the project, and the results are women evaluated the quality of the intervention with the highest score, let's say 100%, and they can consider that around 83% of women had integrated the knowledge that and the training they have acquired in their life into practice, put into practice in their lives. So the overall impact was really positive, and other beneficiaries were also indirect people, let's say like the daughters of the women who belong to the association, and with the daughters, they replicated models of preventing gender violence, and that's another point. The Women Association is still going and training to present and implement projects in their own benefit. Angela is saying that they have one in course with one of the municipalities, and that Angela's team had several inputs to present policy proposals, and they are replicating this model in other projects. So that is pretty much a translation of her answer, and let me pass the microphone to you, Sarah.
Great, thank you, Martin, for the translation. We will now go to some of our participants who've been patiently waiting with their hands up to ask a question. So we will try first for Felisberto Duarte, who had a question. He has his hand raised. So we would ask you, Felisberto, my colleagues are going to unmute your microphone and you can ask your question. If the connection is low, please give us the question in the chat box, but we will try. So please go ahead, Felisberto.
Okay, I am presently studying in South Korea, but I'm actually from Timor-Leste, East Timor. Okay, I find the presentation very interesting, and first of all, I thank everybody for the splendid explanation and contributions, and for the people that have actually have this webinar. I have suggestions to make. That is, I know that this is being piloted in Mozambique, right? So Mozambique is one of the countries that speak Portuguese, like East Timor, Timor-Leste. We have UN Women there. Our government at this moment, they are trying to pass a mineral law so that they can extract gold and extractive industries in our country. But I'm not sure whether they actually include this sort of gender issues within those the mineral laws that they're trying to do in our country. My suggestion is that perhaps UN can contact the UN Women in East Timor to raise this issue with regard to the activities that are being now conducted in some of the countries all over the world, to be able to provide a first step for so that the government understand that there is a necessity of having this gender perspective and protections of gender in when the government is extracting gold and other minerals. So I don't think it has actually been thought out. I know that in our country, gender has been, there is a state secretary for gender equality. I was an advisor for a state secretary for gender equality in 2014. But on the issue of these extractive industries, I don't think it is being mainstreamed there. And second is that I would very much be grateful if we can be sent all the presentations in PDF files of the activities that have been raised and issues here, so that becomes our record, a reference. Thank you.
Thank you, Felisberto, for your comment regarding receiving the presentations. The video recording of this webinar, as well as the slides, will be made available via email in a few days on a link to all participants. I know several asked about that in the chat. That will be made available. Your point you raised on mining law as a way to mainstream gender issues into the law around mining. Another person actually asked this same question, so I'd like to pose to our panelists. If any one of you, of our presenters, had a comment about whether mining law can unlock the potential of women in mining, which is a question we also received earlier. For example, perhaps Javier, we could start with you if you had a comment, because a legal ruling in Colombia was very relevant to giving mandate to several organizations. And so, Hini, perhaps you have also something to add. We'll start with Javier. To what extent can mining laws related to mining unlock the potential for women's participation? Over to you, Javier.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Felisberto, for your question. So, on that sense, on legal recognition of women and women's role and women's work on mining, I think it's very relevant. I mean, it's any type of legislation that has to do with jobs and gender. I think it's necessary. It's been proven that if gender issues are not considered in laws, in rulings, and in specific mandates to organizations, to governments, and so on, it tends to be neglected, and participation and empowerment is tend to be measured as how many people, but not really segregated by gender. And in the case of mining, or at least from the experience in Chocó, that is the one that I've been most exposed to, women's role in mining is already very important. It has been traditionally, especially in Chocó, very important, since most small-scale mining has been undertaken by women. In here they call it barrequeras, and it's women that have this kind of hard net, and it's been filtering by hand tiny pieces of land until they find this kind of gold pearls or gold bits. This has been one of the very examples of sustainable mining, that it doesn't use mercury, that it doesn't lead to massive deforestation. But this is gendered. The way male mining extraction takes place and women-dominated mineral extraction takes place is different. And women, and when it's done by women, they tend to not be protected by law, and not just by mining law, but also by health law, social security law, recognition, family conciliation, and so on. So I think it's very important to legislate and consider that in the different policies that a government might have, to empower them, to recognize them, and to formalize a job that is already taking place, while avoiding unsustainable practices.
Thank you, Javier. Sohini, did you have anything to add on the role that mining law can play to unlock the potential of women's participation?
Hi, yes, certainly. Thanks so much for this comment. It's really inspiring to hear, that there's really participation from all over the world. I know mining is very important in Timor-Leste, throughout throughout the region. And I think there's been a lot of kind of high profile cases in the region as well on gender-based violence and the use of security forces. And so certainly I think as mining laws change and adapt, these are our opportunities for better mainstreaming of these critical issues. So I think, you know, the complexity here is that it spans, you know, various departments within the government. So I certainly think the Ministry of Mining has an important role. I think first, aware of these, and certainly that you're likely aware of in your participation in the forum that you mentioned. I think it's also about cross-pollination between different ministries, so making sure that, for example, the Ministry of Mining is aware of initiatives in the Ministry of Gender or Ministry of Environment. I think in political, certain policy instruments that are perhaps the most effective are around, for example, social safety nets, as Javier just mentioned, you know, for example, making sure that there's, you know, access to justice in the face of perhaps environmental contamination, access to social services around occupational health and employment. So, for example, legislation around making workplaces more inclusive, mine sites more inclusive, making sure that grievance mechanisms are available. So again, you know, that can be at the national level, not necessarily just at the project level. You know, we have to have grievance mechanisms that are accessible to community members, and also that there isn't necessarily fear of reprisal from using those grievance mechanisms, and that they're made in a way that are also accessible to marginalized communities and to women. So for example, if a woman wants to report gender-based violence around a mining site, ensuring that there's you know, a woman is able to access that grievance mechanism comfortably, that there are also perhaps representatives that, you know, speak their language or are women themselves to be in order to receive the grievances. So yes, certainly I think, you know, making sure that mining policy as it evolves and is adjusted, mainstreams some of these you know, broader social inclusion and conflict sensitivity issues and gender issues is very important. So I know that UN Women is doing great work in that regard in terms of peace building, and certainly you know, we'll work in close collaboration and make sure that, you know, our country office representatives in various agencies and organizations are also aware of these trainings and initiatives. And the more examples that you have, you know, for example, from Timor-Leste, the more interesting it'll be. And we'd love to develop more modules, as well as have the modules accessible in various languages, in English, French, and Spanish, and Portuguese, eventually to have the broadest accessibility. So thanks so much for bringing up that experience. And yeah, I certainly think there's enormous potential as policy evolves to mainstream these issues to have greater impact.
Thank you, Sohini. So I will have to wrap it up here. I will give some concluding information for you about how you can receive more information, but I'd like to extend a sincere thanks to each of the presenters for working so well with us in preparation for this, and for your willingness to, you know, use this technology, which is incredible, in bringing together, you know, 140 people from all over the world to have this discussion today. So I apologize to those of you for whom we did not get to your question. A few of the questions I have noted, and we may actually have the opportunity to answer them in Spanish during the Spanish webinar this afternoon. So perhaps we can tempt you to come back and join us in Spanish to address some more questions. And in addition, there will be a video recording of this webinar. Please check the Learning for Nature website at learningfornature.org to access the webinar recording. You'll also receive an email, as I mentioned. There will be available PDF copies of the presentation, and the recording will also be on the Learning for Nature YouTube channel. So please stay tuned for that information and next sessions. You will also see on this slide that should be visible right now that there is the Environmental Governance Program website that also has links to upcoming activities, stories. As more information becomes available about the training Sohini has spoken about, I know people have in the chat box had more questions about it. That will be one place to find out more. So again, the Environmental Governance Program is a joint initiative of the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency and the UN Development Program. And we're very pleased to have had the chance to engage with you today on this topic. I think we covered quite a range of aspects, from what policy tools are available to governments, how the law can be one instrument in enabling greater participation, how we can measure progress of projects that happen at a local level, what type of indicators are useful, and how this connects to the broader SDG agenda and other sectors as well. So this is just the beginning of the conversation, and we really look forward to hearing more from you on this topic. I'm Sarah Dage, and on behalf of the Environmental Governance Program and Learning for Nature teams, I hope you all enjoyed this session. Also, please take a look and respond to our survey, which will be sent out to all of you. This is regarding the training that's being developed. This will help environmental governance and the Intergovernmental Forum for Mining to refine the training on gender, mining, and policy responses. So thanks again, and have a great day or evening wherever you are.